Hi, my name is Samid Ali. I am a PhD student at Dartmouth College. The title of this talk is Armor Within: Defending Against Vulnerabilities in Third-Party Libraries. Let's start with the problem that we are considering here. The problem that we are trying to solve is crafted input attacks, particularly crafted input attacks on third-party libraries. A crafted input attack is an attack in which an adversary constructs a particular payload and sends it to an application with the intent to exploit a vulnerability within that application. If an adversary tries to exploit a vulnerability that is within a library within an application, then that attack is called a crafted input attack on a third-party library. Oftentimes, when developers are creating large applications, they make use of third-party libraries. These third-party libraries may have vulnerabilities in them. What makes these libraries particularly important is that if a vulnerability is found within a library that is exploitable, then it compromises the security of the entire application because the library and the main application share the same address space. As a consequence, if there is a vulnerability within a library that is exploited by an adversary, then that adversary may be able to touch any of the data within the address space of the process. And this kind of attack on a library is particularly persistent and it's very common. And we can see it happen over and over again. Here is an example of a crafted input attack on the libpng library, which could potentially allow an adversary to exploit the application. Here's another example. Here's yet another example of another crafted input attack. And if we look this up inside a CVE database, we will find that there are many such cases in which the vulnerability of a third-party library compromises the security of the overall application. So let's consider an example here to understand how these kind of attacks work. So here we have CVE 2004-0597. This is the famous libpng vulnerability. And some of you may know about it. For those of you who do not, this was a vulnerability in the libpng library that allowed remote code execution. This particular vulnerability was very famous because it had a large impact. It affected Firefox, the Conqueror browser, and a few messaging applications. The libpng library is responsible for parsing a PNG image file. On the right in the diagram here, you can see I have constructed a software architecture of a browser. And in this particular example, what we are looking at is a browser which tries to open up a malicious PNG image. As we can see from this image, the malicious PNG image is not validated by the application logic of the browser because the developers assume that the libpng library will do the validation itself. However, in this case, there was a vulnerability within the libpng library. As a consequence, when an adversary tries to trick the browser into opening this malicious PNG image, it reaches the vulnerable libpng library and it exploits that library. This results in the adversary having access to the sensitive data that is held in the memory of the browser. How can we solve such a problem? We have a few approaches to solve such problems, so our proposed solution involves compartmentalizing the application address space. Second, we suggest that the LangSec validation is applied to the input of the third-party software modules. So by LangSec validation, I mean to say that we insert a LangSec validation parser or filter in the software before the third-party software module. And then we can insert this kind of filter using the object rewriting, which is an approach I will discuss later, and binary rewriting. And lastly, we ensure via control flow integrity that the validation filter that we inserted before the third-party library is not bypassed. The control flow integrity is not violated. So let's consider the same example to illustrate how our approach will work. Here we have the same example where an adversary tries to trick the browser into opening a malicious PNG image file, which exploits the vulnerable libpng library, and thus the adversary accesses the sensitive data. However, in our approach, what we would do is we would insert a LangSec filter before the vulnerable libpng library. As a consequence, when a malicious PNG image will come into, will be opened up by the browser, and it will go toward, and that malicious PNG image will be opened by the vulnerable libpng library. Before it reaches that, there will be a validation filter. This validation filter is where the LangSec parser will validate the libpng image and check whether its grammar is correct. The LangSec validation filter will check the syntactic correctness of the grammar of the PNG image. Thus, if the PNG image is invalid or it's malicious, the validation filter will prevent it from being opened by the vulnerable libpng library. Our approach involves inserting such LangSec parsers or LangSec filters between these third-party libraries and the main application code, such that whenever the main application code calls a function in these third-party libraries, it must go through the validation filter. So the important thing here is that our approach is to insert a LangSec filter within an application. Then we also want to ensure that our LangSec filter that we inserted is not bypassed. To do that, we use control flow integrity techniques provided by the LFBAC Linux kernel. The LFBAC Linux kernel is a custom Linux kernel patch which enforces intra-process memory isolation, and it also enforces control flow integrity. The control flow integrity, in our case, would be to ensure that when we go from the main application code to the library code, we must go through the LangSec filter that we inserted. The filter injection can be done by two approaches. The first one is an object rewriting approach. In this approach, we assume that the library is a dynamically linked library, and we also assume that we have the constituent software modules compiled as separate objects. We then attempt to rewrite the symbol table of the target object such that whenever a symbol corresponding to a function in the vulnerable library is resolved, it instead points to the LangSec parser or the LangSec filter. As a consequence, whenever the symbol is resolved, it will point to the LangSec filter. So if the main application code tries to access the function of the third-party library, it instead will call the LangSec filter, and the filter will then call the third-party library. Therefore, we will ensure that for every function call in the main application code that calls this third-party library, it instead goes to the filter first and then goes to the third-party library. After rewriting the symbol table, we will link the objects together to generate the binary. After generating this binary, we will insert the LFBAC control flow integrity policy to ensure that the filter that we inserted is not bypassed. The second approach will work with statically linked libraries. In this approach, we will lift the binary into LLVM intermediate representation code. Then we will insert the LangSec filter via custom LLVM IR pass, and then compile the LLVM back into a binary and then inject the elf-back policy to ensure control flow integrity. We have discussed the problem that we are trying to solve, our approaches to it, and now we move on to the evaluation. To evaluate our system, we have tried to answer the following three questions. Is our approach effective against known vulnerabilities? The second, how much overhead does our approach add to the existing binaries? And third, can our approach effectively inject parsers in existing binaries and secure them? To evaluate against known vulnerabilities, we carried out experiments on a Xeon E3-1245 processor with 8 gigabits of RAM with Ubuntu Linux with the elf-back Linux kernel patch on it. Armor Within was able to successfully detect and mitigate the following three real-world vulnerabilities that we selected for our evaluation. We were successfully able to inject our parsers in these binaries as well. The first of these vulnerabilities is a denial of service heap-based buffer overread vulnerability in libxml. The second one is a Stack Overflow remote code execution vulnerability in libpng. The third one is a buffer overflow in libpng. Here are the results for the overheads that we got after running our experiments. On the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, we can see the PNG file size in the first column. We are varying the PNG file size and seeing how much overhead we are adding with no instrumentation with the LangSec filter and with the LangSec filter along with the elf-back policy. And here we can see the time that the no instrumentation has and the LangSec filter has and the LangSec filter has with the elf-back policy. After running these experiments, we found that our approach was effective and usable in preventing these preventing crafted input attacks against third-party libraries. In conclusion, we present two approaches to inject LangSec filters within binaries. The first one is by rewriting the symbol table, and the second is by rewriting the binary. We show that it is possible to insert a LangSec filter within an application, which can effectively prevent vulnerabilities in third-party libraries from being exploited. We note that the first technique is suited to dynamically linked libraries, whereas the second one is effective for statically linked libraries. We found out that our tools were effective at preventing known vulnerabilities and added minimal overhead in terms of memory usage and CPU time to existing binaries. In the future, we plan to extend Armor Within to work with any parser combinator toolkit. As of now, Armor Within only works with the parser combinator toolkit of Hammer. Another potential future work that we're looking at is to make our approach agnostic to the control flow integrity technique. Right now, we have used elf-back to ensure control flow integrity, but Armor Within could be used with other control flow integrity techniques, and that is something that we are working on. Third is we are working on a parser generator that allows the developers to convert a BNF syntax to a parser combinator syntax. This will allow the developers to write the grammar for these LangSec filters that they're inserting in an easy fashion, such that they will just write the grammar of the input file format in a BNF syntax, and the parser combinator syntax will be generated automatically. That concludes my talk. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask.